My name is Tom Schwartz. I'm the director. And it's good to see so many of you out today on this Labor Day weekend to help us commemorate and remember Laura Ingalls Wilder. Many people want to know, why do we have this program every year over Labor Day weekend at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum? Were Herbert Hoover and Laura Ingalls Wilder somehow connected? Well, the connection was actually through her daughter, Rose. Rose Wilder Lane wrote the first campaign biography for Herbert Hoover in 1920, not at Hoover's insistence, but kind of on her own. Hoover's name was mentioned as a presidential candidate that year. And it's an interesting biography. It contains lots of information, and it kind of remained the standard until his friend Vernon Kellogg wrote another biography, and then really the biography started coming out in '28 when he was the official Republican nominee. For many years, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote the Little House books. Her daughter wrote her own books, and it wasn't until Laura Ingalls Wilder died, Rose became the literary executor of the estate of her mother's papers. And then when Rose died, she had no heirs. And so the literary rights reverted to Roger McBride, who was a friend of Rose and a fellow libertarian. Rose is one of kind of the three female figures that founded the libertarian movement in this country, the others being Isabel Patterson and Ayn Rand. Roger, when he was going through the papers, realized that there were all of these folders about Herbert Hoover, and he contacted the library. Dwight Miller, who was senior archivist at the time, was asked to come and take a look at them, and he did. And so a decision was made to move all of Rose's papers here to the Hoover Library. And then as those papers were being processed, it was discovered that many of Laura Ingalls Wilder's own writings and drafts of chapters and books were contained in Rose's papers. There began a long kind of debate over to what extent were Rose and her mother collaborators, or was Rose a ghostwriter, or on and on. That's not a debate we need to resolve, but it does indicate why we ended up with papers of Laura Ingalls Wilder. We are the only other presidential library, other than the John F. Kennedy, to have the papers of a literary figure among their collections. The Kennedy Library has the papers of Ernest Hemingway, and they have those papers only because of the relationship between Hemingway's widow and Mrs. Onassis. And she was looking for a place to put them, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis said, "You can put them here at the Kennedy Presidential Library." And so there is a Hemingway room at the Kennedy Library that you can go to. You need to get special permission. It's not really part of the public tour there. But I think, ironically, both the Hemingway collection and the Laura Ingalls Wilder collection, Rose Wilder Lane collection, get almost as much attention as the presidents, their respective presidents. So, it would be wrong of us not to commemorate the fact that we have these very important materials in our possession. The other connection, though, is that having read the Little House books, and I must admit I didn't read them until I became director here. But it does show this interesting transition, between the frontier and the beginning of modern life, where modern life kind of takes over. Laura Ingalls Wilder's recollections of what it was like growing up on the frontier, the constant movement, and I'm exhausted just reading about how many times they moved and had to, build a cabin and clear the land. I mean, it really, when you think about the amount of just intense labor and all of that. So it also does fit with kind of Herbert Hoover's philosophy, which does emphasize the importance of the individual in building this country and maintaining it. I also want to bring your attention, our foundation has a table out there. If you're not a member, I hope you pick up an application, consider becoming a member. It's because of our foundation that we can do programs such as this one. And many of the improvements, they help secure a $108,000 grant in order to enhance the audio and projection systems, not only in this auditorium, but in our classroom. We now have a smart board, which lets us connect with libraries across the state of Iowa, and to do kind of long distance learning. And so we have them to thank. I also want to thank the quilters today who have been working on the bear claw quilt in the Oberg room. Really appreciate your time and talents. For those of you who haven't seen the bear claw quilt, you pop in afterwards in the Oberg room. Also, West Branch, the high school football team, are known as the Bears. So there's also that connection as well. But the bear claw is one of a number of quilt patterns that are mentioned by Laura Ingalls Wilder as well. So our speaker today, obviously many of you already know about her, is the respected Wilder authority, Sarah Uthoff. Sarah is past president of the National Laura Ingalls Wilder Organization. Soon after she discovered Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, she was playing Laura, visiting the Laura sites and learning how to do the things that Laura did around her family farm. In the words of one cousin, Laura took over her life and everybody's who knew her. When Uthoff grew up, she got her degree in history education, got actively involved with living history and historic foodways, and began to research the history and life around Laura Ingalls Wilder. Uthoff is just as at home handling original documents for primary research as she is troubleshooting a technology problem. Finding her all over social media, especially her Trundlebed Tales podcast. Uthoff is currently a reference librarian at Kirkwood Community College and serves as director of the Oxford Public Library. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Uthoff.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me all right? It's okay to say no. Most of the time people say, do I have to have, or I don't need to have a mic, and it's like, yes, you need to have a mic. Today's program, I call A Long Way Home, and it's the story of how Laura's life became the Little House Books. You see, it wasn't as easy as everybody thinks. People always have this picture in their head of Laura sitting down at a desk and writing out the words to the books, and like Moses carving into a tablet is the word perfect. But that's not how books get written. And today we are actually going to be pretending. In just a minute, I'm going to put on my gloves and start talking as if I think I am Laura Ingalls Wilder and the year is 1931. Now, Laura had always been interested in words and in writing, and starting in 1911, she'd done basically 2 columns a month for the Missouri Ruralist. She had stopped doing that in 1924 and started working on this idea to write the story of her life. Now, people, you know how people are when they get an idea in their head and they ask somebody and they say, oh yeah, you should do it, but then they have to ask somebody else and then they have to ask somebody else, and they talk about it for a long time before they actually get around to doing anything. I think that's what Laura did, because there are lots of people who will swear they were the one who told Laura to write the Little House books. So we're going to today pretend to be those people. It's going to be 1931 in Mansfield, Missouri, and Laura has invited you to Rocky Ridge. Now, I told you she stopped writing in 1924 for the Ruralist. She wrote out a draft of the story of her life, and she gave it to her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, and thought that it would just be sold and published immediately, because that's pretty much how her columns had worked for the Ruralist. She'd written them out, they'd send them off and printed them pretty much as is. That's not how books work. And in fact, Rose's agent had sent around to all the publishers in New York, and everybody said, no, they didn't think so. Which, you can actually read that very book now. It's since been published as Pioneer Girl. But having read it, I say the publishers were right. It needed work yet. So, not to be discouraged, after talking with a friend of Rose's, Berta Hayter, they decided to rewrite the books, the Pioneer Girl, as a sort of a texty picture book. And so they did that, and it was called When Grandma Was a Little Girl. And they sent that around all over the publishers again to see if anybody would publish it. And again, nobody would. But one publisher, Knopf, said, you know, this would make a good chapter book. If you rewrite this one more time as a chapter book, maybe we'll publish it. Well, this has been all the way from really 1928 was when she started working solidly on it, but really from about 1924 all the way to 1931, and now she's being told to rewrite it again. So she isn't really sure if she wants to put that work in. So she is going to put it to you, her friends who are coming to Rocky Ridge. She's going to tell you the story of her life, and you can tell her whether she should keep writing the books or not. And Laura thought it was important, if you were going someplace fancy or to visit, that you do things like have your gloves on. So Laura is going to have her gloves on here. Charles or C.P. Ingalls, or Pa, Caroline Ingalls, or Ma, Mary Ingalls, who's Laura's oldest sister, Laura herself, Carrie, Grace, and of course, Jack the Bulldog. Then, on the Wilder family, and we don't touch on them as much, but to be fair, there was James Wilder, who was Father Wilder, Angeline, who was Mother, Eliza Jane Wilder, who nobody can forget if you've read the books, Royal Wilder, who is Almanzo's older brother, Alice Wilder, who is his sister, and Almanzo himself, and to even out Jack, Lucy the pig. So with that, I'm going to put on my gloves, and we're going to find ourselves in 1931 Missouri. Hold on to your hats. Well, hello everyone. I'm so glad you could come to Rocky Ridge today. Please come in, be seated. I know I've told you all about my project before. My daughter Rose, of course, is the writer in the family, but I think maybe I could do something along that line too. You know about my work in the Ruralist. And I thought, I think the children today have forgotten too much about what the past was like. So I think that they should have a book that tells them all about how America came to be through a family story, my family story. But I've been working on this project for a very long time now, and I just don't know if it's going to work or not. And so I thought if I told you the story that I want to write, you can tell me, is it worth doing the extra work, rewriting it one more time, or am I just fooling myself? So the story begins in Pepin, Wisconsin, which is on the shores of beautiful Lake Pepin. Mark Twain called it true sunset country, and Bryant said every poet and artist in the land ought to visit. Of course, we didn't live on the lake. We lived 7 miles into the big woods in a little log cabin. Trees surrounded us all around. And it was my pa and my ma, my older sister Mary, and me. Pa felt that despite the fact we had family all around, and there was all sorts of ways to get sort of extras out of the area, like honey or maple syrup or fish, that he was just so tired of fighting the trees. How many people here have had a walnut tree in their yard? And how many of you have gotten sick of fighting the little suckers? Yeah. So imagine that's your whole wheat field that you're trying to grow your crops in, and the trees are trying to take all of it. Pa thought that the best thing would be to get out of those trees. And so he loaded us all up and headed us south to Independence, Kansas. There was a big land push for Kansas at that time. Not that we had any right to be there. You see, there was a treaty giving the Osage tribe right to the land. But Pa thought that the land was going to be opened up any day now, and if we went first, we'd get our pick. And so he found a spot on the prairie, and that is where we built our new little house, near the Verdigris River. Ma felt, compared to Pepin, where there were trees and people all around, lonely and exposed on the prairie. And it didn't help when she had my little baby sister Carrie. And if there's anything to make you feel more insecure is having a helpless baby to have to take care of. She did not like Kansas. And Kansas, it sort of seemed, didn't like us. There were prairie fires, we got fever and ague, and there were rumors coming that for once the government actually was going to honor its treaty, and soldiers were coming to push the settlers out. That didn't actually happen, but just the thought it was enough to stir up Pa. And when we got word that the man who had bought our farm in Pepin hadn't made his next payment and was going to renege on the deal, we decided we would head back up to Pepin. And it was during our second stay there that I actually went to school for the very first time with Mary. And a lot of the things that I would tell about in that first book would come from my memories then. And it really, I loved Pepin in the big woods, but Pa still found things to be pretty much the way they'd been that made him leave before. And so next thing you knew, we'd sold off again, and this time we were heading west to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and the banks of Plum Creek. We had a house built right by the creek side, and Mary and I loved playing in it. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a dugout, but let me show you what it is. They take a hill and they carve out a room. Then taking a very special plow called a sod cutter, they cut strips of prairie sod and then pile it up grass side down to make the front wall and as much of the sides as you need. Then they put long poles going one way, short poles going the other, cover it all up with straw, and then more prairie sod again, grass side up this time, and the next thing you know, you're living in the side of a hill like a rabbit. Now, looking at that roof, do you think that would be very good to hold out dirt? How about bugs? How about snakes? Yeah, actually, Saudis are notorious for having snake problems. Snakes really love Saudis. And in fact, there was even one memorable occurrence when an ox's leg went right through that roof. Saudis could be very warm because they didn't take a lot of insulation, and they were nice, but they would be, a dirt floor, dirt walls, even if they were whitewashed. And it was kind of a clammy, dark way to live. And Pa didn't see why we had to, because there was the crop of wheat. And I will break character a minute to tell you why this picture is there, even though it isn't the best quality. It's because this was one of the last times Pa's wheat field was actually in wheat back in the 80s. And I took a picture of it. It's all wildflowers now, which is very nice to visit, but it isn't wheat. Pa looked at that wheat and he thought that we were going to be as rich as kings as soon as the harvest came. Now, he didn't see any reason we should stay in this little dank hole in the ground when we had all that money coming, so he borrowed money against us to make us a wonderful house. It had store-bought boards from a sawmill, far smoother than any Pa could make with his axe. It had real glass windows, so you could see out and get light in no matter what the weather. There was a second floor, so Mary and I had our own room upstairs, and Ma had a new oven complete with a prairie chimney so the rain wouldn't come down. It was a wonderful house. Even the doors, instead of just having latch strings, had real china doorknobs. I just couldn't believe it. It was ours. But Pa said it would be as soon as he could harvest the wheat. And it was almost ready. It was looking beautiful. Just a few more days. And then the grasshoppers came. They ate everything in sight. The leaves on the trees, the grass on the ground, Ma's garden. And despite everything Pa did to try and stop them, they ate the wheat. There would be no crop that year, and there was still the debt on the house to pay. In fact, things were so bad that Pa actually got relief from the Minnesota state government. Governor Pillsbury sent out 2.5 bushels of flour. Yes, that Pillsbury. It was a hard time. But we had been working on the church in town in Walnut Grove. And Pa found out that they were just a few dollars short of how much they would need to get a bell to go in the church. Now, we'd put time and money into it already. And Pa thought that we would need that money rather badly. He thought perhaps he'd buy a new pair of leather boots since he was going to have to outwalk the grasshoppers. We didn't have enough money to go on the train like some of the men would. But Pa decided to give those few last dollars that he would have spent on boots to the church. Now, a lot of people would think that was a rather foolish suggestion. But when he got his first check, he got his new pair of leather boots. And they're long gone. But I hear tell that same bell still rings in Walnut Grove every Sunday. So maybe it wasn't so foolish after all. Well, those grasshoppers had done something worse than eat everything in sight. They had laid eggs. There would be no crops the next year either. And so Pa made a deal with some people we knew in Walnut Grove, the Stedmans, and we headed to Burr Oak, Iowa, and the Masters Hotel. We were going to help the Stedmans run it. Ma would do the cooking, and Mary and I'd help as we could, make beds, sweep floors, watch the Stedman children. It really wasn't fair. We ended up having to do more than our share of the work, though to be fair, Mrs. Stedman really was sick. A couple years after we left, they had to operate her and pulled out a tumor later described as the size of a basketball. But it didn't help us out any. Ma didn't like being in the hotel because there was actually a saloon right above where our bedroom would be. And Burr Oak had definitely seen better days. At one time, over 200 wagons a day would be coming through, but now that had slowed to a trickle. We got by mostly on weekly boarders and the fact that we'd made a deal with the wagon, or the stagecoach driver, that he could have a free bed for the night if he brought his people to see us, instead of going to the nicer hotel across the street.
Oh my God.
They did that even then. But Ma wanted us out of the hotel. So at first, Pa rented a room above the general store next door, and then later a whole house, because Ma was going to have a baby. And our last sister, baby Grace, was born, and our little family was complete. And that is, that is why we check these things out ahead of time. There we go. Mary and me and Ma and Pa and Carrie and Grace. Now, we ended up leaving Burr Oak. Pa thought that he'd been, well, there's not a much nicer way to say it, gypped. And so he ended up heading out to take us back to Walnut Grove. We either had enough money to make it there or to pay our last month's rent before we left. And so we ended up having to leave in the middle of the night and sending the money back. Pa thought our luck would change with this new time in Walnut Grove, and he was right. It got worse. We all had gotten sick, but it seemed to settle in Mary's eyes, and it just ended up making her feel almost helpless. The newspapers even reported it. Miss Mary Ingalls, daughter of C.P. Ingalls of this place, has been quite ill for some time, but is thought to be slowly recovering. May 1879. May 15th, 1879. Miss Mary Ingalls is still confined to her bed, and at times her sufferings are great. June 26th, 1879. Miss Mary Ingalls' health improves, but her sight is so much impaired that she cannot distinguish one object from another. She can discern day from night, but even this slight vision is also failing. Mr. and Mrs. C.P. Ingalls are expecting to take their daughter Mary to St. Paul in a short time, in hopes that they can have something done for her eyesight. Although entirely blind, she is very patient and submissive. July 31st, 1879. Mary was always the golden sister. She was blonde, and I always thought she was prettier than I was, and she was smart. She talked about doing things like writing books and teaching school. And now she was almost completely helpless. It was up to me to step up and become the older sister. And so it seemed like a miracle when Aunt Dosia, Pa's sister, showed up and asked if he wanted a job working on the railroad. C.P. Ingalls, who is taking charge of a gang of men near Lake Benton, made a visit to town last week and reports work progressing rapidly and thinks in a short time trains will run to Lake Benton. Mrs. C.P. Ingalls and family started for Dakota on Saturday's westbound passenger train. She goes to rejoin her husband, who is at work on the Chicago and Dakota Railroad west of Lake Benton. We are sorry to lose them, but what is our loss is their gain. So we were going to start over again, this time in DeSmet, South Dakota. Now, that was my very first trip on a train. I don't know if you've ever been on a train before, but let me tell you, it is something. The train cars have rows of red velvet seats. There's a man with a brass plaque on his hat that says conductor and comes along and punches your tickets. A boy came with a tray full of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and little packages of Christmas candy, and Ma got us some, and it wasn't even Christmas. But my favorite was the tin cup, because at the far end of the car there was a little faucet, and if you turned it, water came out. After I drank some, I took some back for Ma and the girls, and I think by that second trip, you couldn't tell that I'd never been on a train before. Oh, you didn't even flinch. Now, of course, that was a very memorable trip of 6 miles. That got us to the next town up the line, which is Tracy, Minnesota. And it was there that we met Pa, and he took us back first to the Brookings camp and then eventually to DeSmet and Silver Lake. Now, DeSmet was named by the railroad for Father DeSmet, who was a Jesuit missionary, mostly out in Wyoming. But there was a story, maybe true, maybe not, that he'd once camped somewhere near DeSmet. And railroads can do pretty much whatever they want, so they named the town for him. At first, we lived on the shores of Silver Lake in sort of a little barracks kind of house. We were there for the summer and to help feed the crew and all of those kind of things, and thought we would have to go back to Walnut Grove to spend the winter. So when one of the railroad men asked Pa if he would be winter watchman and stay in the surveyor house, it was another miracle, because we could stay out in Dakota. We didn't have to go back and then come out again, and there was food and fuel already stacked up to last us all winter. And it was the biggest house I had ever lived in. That was just a private house. Of course, I think you could probably fit 2.5 of them in this room. But it was, at least it was a nice finished space. And it was good that it did have some room, because that winter started a land rush on Dakota. We had all sorts of people show up, and Pa and Ma would rent them a space on the floor for the night and charge them for a meal. In a way, we almost had to, because there wasn't much in the way of other buildings, and it was still freezing outside at night. But it was a good, too, because even though it was really the railroad's goods we were using, they told us we could use all we wanted. So we took the money that we earned selling them to save for Mary, because we had found out that there was a school for the blind in Iowa, and the family had a new goal, that despite her blindness, Mary was going to get to go to school. One day, there were just little surveyor stakes all over town, and the next, buildings had popped up like mushrooms. At least that's how it seemed with their little false fronts. And they had big plans for De Smet. They were going to have a whole large town because it was going to be the county seat. While we were still in the surveyor's house, Pa began to throw up an office building or a store building in town. Now this isn't where he built it, but this is the same building. And he was going to, first he had to move us into it because the man whose claim the surveyor's house was sitting on quite rightly objected to having other people live on his land. And so we moved in there and would later spend the hard winter in that building. Pa had already picked out and filed on our homestead. And when he heard there were reports of men in the area to jump claims, he decided he needed to get us moved out immediately. And he built us a house in 3 days. It looked like half a chicken coop. Now remember, this is where Pa, Ma, Mary, me, Carrie, and Grace would be living until we could afford to put an addition on the house. They weren't called claim shacks for nothing. But slowly, we were able to improve the land. Pa planted cottonwood trees that would create a windbreak. And addition by small addition, we were able to make an actual farmhouse and not just a little shanty on the land. And most important, we had finally saved up enough money to send Mary to the school for the blind in Vinton, Iowa. Now, the main building there was called Old Main, and it has it had rooms on each of the 2 side wings. The girls were on this side, the boys on the other. The classrooms and the auditorium and all those sorts of things were in the middle. Mary attended school there, did just as well in deportment and as poorly in math as Laura reported, and then graduated eventually. Meanwhile, I had changed myself. I had stopped being a schoolgirl in order to teach school. And I taught 3 terms. And I absolutely hated it. On August 25th, 1885, I married Almanzo James Wilder, my Manly. Isn't he handsome? Now, he'd built me a little gray house in the west on his tree claim. But we inherited all of Pa's bad luck. And by the time our daughter Rose was born, we were having to live back on his homestead. Now, we lost crops to hail. We lost crops to drought. The barn burned with the year's hay supply inside. And when the house burned, one of the few things they were able to save was a glass bread plate like this one. We had 2 children. The oldest was a girl. She was named for the wild roses we used to see when we took rides on the prairie when we were courting. The second was a little boy who looked just like Manly. But he died before we even got him named. But the last thing that really did us in Dakota was the diphtheria. There was an epidemic. I had it worse, but Manly tried to go back to work too soon and had some kind of seizure. He never really recovered again. So we ended up selling out and went to spend some time with his family in Spring Valley, Minnesota. They'd moved there after they'd left Malone. His mother's uncle had owned a horse farm there in Spring Valley, and that's where they moved. Just that year while they were there, they opened a new Methodist church. But the weather was still too hard on Manly, and so we were soon en route again, this time following my cousin Peter down to Florida. I bet you didn't know you could homestead in Florida, did you? Well, Peter did it, proved up and everything. But I did not like Florida. In Florida, it is not strange to see a plant that eats meat. It is not strange to see an alligator walk up into your front yard. It is strange to see a Yankee woman. We left Florida as soon as we could arrange it, and in the meantime, I started wearing my revolver. And we aren't going back. Instead, we came back to DeSmet, bought a small house, spent a lot of time with Rose visiting the folks in their house on the 3rd Street in DeSmet, and saved up money. Manly and I needed another fresh start. This one had to take. And so we'd saved up about $100. And some friends of ours, the Coolies, had told us all about the land of the Big Red Apple, Mansfield, Missouri, Gem City of the Ozarks. And so we followed them to Mansfield. On the way, I wrote in a writing desk, a little diary of our trip. And I'd hid the $100 that we'd saved inside the desk. The next 2 weeks were terrible. Every day I went and looked in the desk. It had to be there. It wasn't there. It had to be. It wasn't. It had. And then I felt a little bump under the red velvet. It had slipped under the lining as we headed south. And this time, for once, I did not get dressed up before I went to town. We went straight in, and I put down the $100 at the bank as a down payment, and Rocky Ridge was ours. Now today when people visit, they often say, "Why do you call the place Rocky Ridge?" This is the front yard. But it does look much nicer today than it did then. And we've really built Rocky Ridge into something. Over 200 acres improved land, some of the best horse flesh west of the Mississippi River. We, at one time, were sending train car loads full of apples to Kansas City and St. Louis. There's Manly's milk goats and my prize-winning chickens. And all of that has led to us having a 10-room farmhouse. And I do, besides all my farm wife work with butter and eggs, I keep it up and clean and do my writing and everything. I really believe that a small farm home is the best life. And so I would write little things for the paper, and I would give speeches. I would go out and tell people all about how they could successfully have a small farm of their own. In fact, I had one speech called the chicken speech, where I gave everyone all my secrets for getting $1 pure profit per hen. In fact, when later asked to describe me, one of my neighbors said, "She can get eggs in the winter when no one else can." So I could not, I got invited to give this speech at a certain event, and I couldn't get there. So I wrote it all out, sent it off to have somebody read it in absentia for me. And in the audience that day was a man named John Case, who worked for the Missouri Ruralist. How many people have heard of the Missouri Ruralist? Few, better than I usually get. How many people have heard of Capper's Weekly or Monthly or Farmer as they call it now? Okay, this is a paper run by the same company that does Capper's. It's very similar, except, surprise, surprise, it's about Missouri. So I wrote columns for them from 1911 to 1924, and that's when I really started to get serious about writing this book. But like I said, it's my life. Maybe I'm too close to it. Maybe I just am fooling myself and it isn't worth a book. What do you think? Should we write it? Should I rewrite it one more time?
Yes. Yes.
Good, because if you say no at that point, it gets very awkward. So, Laura did write her book, and it came out, it helps to take the rest of the mic with you when you're speaking. And in 1932, out came Little House in the Big Woods, the book that no depression could stop. And it was so well received that there became a whole series of books. Little House in the Big Woods, Farmer Boy. Little House on the Prairie, on the banks of Plum Creek. By the shores of Silver Lake, The Long Winter. Little Town on the Prairie, These Happy Golden Years. And that's where Laura left her story, with Manzo and Laura sitting there in the little gray home in the West, happy and content, unknowing of all the troubles that were about to break over their heads. But she had tried an adult novel at some point. Now there's a lot of debate about this. We know it's at least after 1933 because there's some Farmer Boy stuff used in the papers she used. And Bill Anderson thinks that means it had to have been written very close to 33 because nobody uses that old scrap paper. At the time when I first heard him say that, we were using my father's thesis copies from the 60s. So I don't know that I hold with that. But at some point, Laura did try and write an adult novel, but as she got into it, she really realized it was a different thing. And she wanted to end her story there in DeSmet. But after her death and Rose's, the first 4 years, or as Laura called it, the first 3 years in a year of grace was published. So if you're ever wondering why it just seems so different from the other books, it really was a very rough draft indeed. And if it had moved forward with being published, there would have been a lot more work on it. Now, even though it has been, well, we're almost rounding the home stretch, getting to be 100 years since the books came out. People still love the books, and the children they were written for have shared them with their children, grandchildren, and sometimes even great-grandchildren. And the people are still thought of and remembered too. And I thought you might want to know what happened to some of the people we met in the books. Now, one, of course, is Mary Ingalls. She did attend the School for the Blind, and she graduated. And today in the audience, we have someone who's worked very hard to get the school open for touring. Do you want to give a wave? Now, sadly, right now it isn't, and I will explain afterwards if you want, but it's a whole political thing, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But you can still walk the grounds, and there is a sign there that says Mary Ingalls Home Site with a beautiful sign that I had a little input on. So take lots of pictures and post it. Mary had graduated and came back and lived with Ma and Pa in DeSmet. Pa had won his bet with the government and got the homestead, but his health was really starting to fail fairly quickly, and so he sold the homestead after renting it a couple years, and they built addition by addition the house in town on 3rd Street. And then Pa passed away. For many years, Ma and Mary lived together in that 3rd Street house. Ma said that Mary was her feet and that Ma was Mary's eyes. Carrie had had some health issues and then became a working girl working for the local newspaper in town. She did so well that she was hired by a syndicate to go and run little newspapers all over Dakota Territory. And she'd had a preemption claim herself in Phillip, South Dakota. And she married a man named David Swainsey, who was a widower and a mine owner. And they lived in Keystone, right where this Keystone Mercantile building is today. Now, you might have heard about Keystone because how many people have been to Mount Rushmore? There are only two towns real close there. One is Keystone and one is Hill City. Keystone's a little closer. So if you ever go back, go up to the top of the old town, and the Keystone Area Historical Society has a display for Cary, and actually they have some things for most of the family members, including what they think is the original China Shepherdess. Now other people have questions, but they are convinced this is the China Shepherdess. So you can go and see it there if you want. Grace followed Laura's path a little more closely in that she taught school. But she didn't just get a little training, she actually went to normal school at Redfield College. Go Redfield! Now she married a man named Dow, and they lived in the next town down the railroad from De Smet called Manchester. And you're probably thinking to yourself, I never heard of Manchester. But you very well might have, because there was this is the town that the F5 tornado went through when there were all the storm chasers there. So it made the cover of National Geographic. It made there's a Nova special, Search for the Super Twister. If you look it up, you can watch the houses of Manchester blowing across the Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Highway. And this is what the town looked like before. And this was about a year after the tornado. And this is it today. Most of the town's gone. They do have a memorial, and they've saved the town pump. And actually, the roads will still show up. If you've got a GPS map that you're going by, the roads are still there, and you can drive around the empty town of Manchester if you want to. Grace and her husband Nate ended up buried just behind the Ingalls family plot. Royal, Almanzo's brother, spent a lot of time going back and forth between De Smet and Spring Valley. While he was in Spring Valley, his mother decided it was time that he should be married. So she kept sending him over with stuff to a widow in town. Some extra eggs, a loaf of bread they'd done too much, some cookies, and eventually he got the hint and married her. They had 3 daughters. 2 died as infants, and they're buried there beside him. The other one ended up in California and was buried in a pretty famous cemetery out in Los Angeles. Almanzo and Laura continued to live at Rocky Ridge. They sold off bits and pieces of their land, eventually mostly kept a life estate in the house and buildings. Laura had all her fans. She said that tourists beat farmers for rising early. It was so nice to have visitors knock on the door at 7:30 in the morning. But she really appreciated everyone sending their love and appreciation for her books to her. She would try and respond to about every fan letter that was sent to her, at least one to the class, except when she really wasn't in very good health. They tried to get her to write more books, but she said she was going to spend the rest of her life living it and not just writing about it. And besides, Almanzo's health was getting worse. He was older than her, roughly 10 years, and he needed to be taken care of. He'd been in and out of the hospital, but now he was out again, and they thought, it looks like he'll get better for a while. But one night, he had some kind of spell, and Laura phoned for help, and before it got there, he died in her arms. Laura said that if Manly could live to be 90, I can too. And so she did. She died 3 days after her 90th birthday in 1957. Their only daughter, Rose, had gone on from all sorts of adventures to becoming a writer. She won an O. Henry Prize, actually the story was about the family's time in Florida, and was known for being one of the highest paid magazine writers in the country. Unfortunately, magazines don't stick around much, and people had started to sort of forget who she was. Plus, like many people, after they spend their life writing fiction, suddenly get interested in a calling, whether it's religion or politics. And with Rose, it was politics. And she, as I mentioned, became part of the libertarian movement. And this is actually the Freedom School, which was a libertarian college in Colorado, and it's Rose Wilder Lane Hall. Now, the college is long out of existence, but the building is still there. And I'm still hoping sometime we'll be able to have a Laura event out in Rose Wilder Lane Hall. She was still a firecracker. And she had done everything between covering the aftermath of World War I in Europe to being the oldest known woman correspondent to cover the war in Vietnam.